Yes. Raise your hand using the feature built into Zoom. This way, I will know who to call on next. For those not using your phones to join this meeting, remember to put it on silent because it will affect the audio quality. I will now introduce the Minister of Health, the Honorable Terence Dial Singh, to give you an update on COVID-19 in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Minister Cox. Good morning to you. Good morning to the Attorney General, the Honorable Faris.
19 in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Minister Cox. Good morning to you. Good morning to the Attorney General, the Honorable Faris Al-Rawi, ladies and gentlemen of Trinidad and Tobago, members of the media. As part of our daily updates, I would like to bring the country up to date on what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago as far as COVID-19 is concerned. But I always like to contextualize it in the global context. So globally, the latest figures are 955,099 cases. Deaths to date globally, 48,569. Recovered patients to date globally, 202,941. What those figures don't tell you is what has happened since March the 10th globally. Up until March the 10th, the total number of deaths was around 10,000. But what you saw after March the 10th was an absolute exponential growth in deaths from March the 10th of 10,000 to today's figures of 48,569. The death graph was going in a linear fashion up until from January 22nd. But from March the 10th, there was an absolute exponential growth. What does that mean for Trinidad and Tobago, and how do we contribute to those figures? In Trinidad and Tobago, we have 90 positive cases to date, of which 49 came from one source, which is an outlier. It means for statistical reasons we don't consider it. Leaving outside of that 49, 41 cases. We recorded our first death on March 26th, and to date we have had 5 deaths, unfortunately, and our deepest condolences go out to those 5 families. We have discharged 1 person to date, and CARFA has conducted 621 tests to date. The caseload by globally is 122.5 per million. I give you these updates on a daily basis. It is going up. Trinidad and Tobago's caseload is remaining around the same of about 64 per million. So we are about a half of the global average in terms of caseload per million. However, today, April the 2nd, marks an inflection point, a turning point in how we treat with COVID-19. If we as a society heed the warnings of the Prime Minister, the Minister of Health, the Chief Medical Officer, the Commissioner of Police, civil society, and if we stay home, our healthcare resources will not be depleted. However, if we behave in a manner that is contrary to all the advice that we have been given out, I fear that we could have a depletion of scarce resources. I say this because, as you know, international supply chains have been affected globally. All countries are competing for scarce resources. Moving forward, if the population does not heed the warning to do this, stay home, stay safe, we will be in a bad position. I am urging the population to help us manage our resources, help us manage the stress that is being put on the healthcare system, the stress on nurses and doctors who have risen to the occasion to beat this virus so we don't get exponential growth in the number of cases. Today, as promised, we are going to be showing you the GIS mapping so you could see for yourselves Trinidad and Tobago where our cases lie and the risks involved in moving about at this point in time. My hope is that that map will bring a degree of sobriety into the discussion, that those few individuals who still insist on moving around will see that by doing that, they are putting the country at risk, and resources will be depleted. We are fighting for resources on an international market that has been disrupted. So the short message today is help us, and the best thing that anyone can do at this time to help healthcare workers is to stay home. And if we do that, heed the warnings from the Prime Minister, Commissioner of Police, Minister of National Security, myself, Chief Medical Officer, we will beat this together. But my fear is, if we don't, we will not be in a good position. So my urge is from today, stay home unless you are going out for urgent medical business or other business that is absolutely critical to your well-being and survival. Minister Cox, that's my short message this morning, and I hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Minister of Health. And we will now hear from the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Roshan Paraswaram, who will speak on the application of GIS technology to manage COVID-19.
Good morning, honorable ministers, members of the viewing public. I just want to start by giving a little definition of what the geographic information system that the Ministry of Health is using and has been helping significantly in the tracing of contacts and the tracing of cases as we progress through this epidemic. So a geographic information system, in terms of definition, is an information system, gives us a framework for gathering, managing, and analyzing data. Its application in terms of the COVID-19 response has been used predominantly for mapping of patients and their contacts, visualizing the chain of transmission, so the actual chain of transmission as well as the potential for spread, spatial and temporal analyses, databasing and querying of information. The benefits of GIS and the use of GIS to the Ministry of Health is basically providing an evidence-based platform for decision making. So we're not making decisions in an ad hoc manner. We are using the technology to assist us looking at our primary cases, secondary cases, tertiary cases, and actually learning from them how the cases are being spread, how they are moving about, and allowing us to manage our strategically placed and manage our resource base, which is essential to combating an epidemic, to ensure that our resources are not outstripped. So the first map that I wanted to show are laboratory confirmed COVID-19 cases in Trinidad and Tobago. This is the first of two maps. So if you look at the chart, the size of the red circle gives an indication of the actual number of cases in those particular areas. So if you start with Tobago, we see that Tobago has two cases shown on the map. And if you move across to Trinidad, the cases starting on the northwest, there's a cluster along the east-west corridor that leads further down into the Caroni area towards Couva and Shogunas, and then we see it going along the western border all the way down to Pinal, Siparia, those areas passing through San Fernando. There's a star on the right that you can see on the top of the map, which is our cluster of cases, 49 cases that represent the Balandra population that came straight off the airplane and went to Balandra. We are capturing that as the star up in the corner so that there's no further spread from that jurisdiction. Some of those cases, as you know, would have been moved to Couva and Cora respectively over the past few days and weeks. If we go to the second map. Right. So this gives an indication of how cases have moved during, and it does not map all 90 cases. This is just an example. It gives movement for 10 of the 90, and the green lines represent how secondary cases, the blue dots, are secondary cases or potential secondary contacts. The yellow dots are tertiary. So it gives you some idea of the movement across the country. So what we're seeing, you can see a primary case in the northwest of the country moving all the way down to the south. So there's there's no limit to the movement that any one case can have. We are seeing a dearth of cases right now in the southeast of the country as well as in the northeast. But let us be clear that any one of those cases could have moved to a gathering in any of those areas that we're not seeing an active case and potentially infected someone and given us this, as we discussed a couple of days ago, there's the possibility of hidden contacts. And that's why, and that is the most dangerous thing in any epidemic, where we have cases being contacted by persons who they don't know, and they're moving about freely and continue to do so, and they contaminate that entire area. So let us not use this as a source for the people in the unaffected areas as shown on the map. And don't be complacent. We have asked the country to go on a state of lockdown because we don't know where the hidden cases are going to be. So following on those maps, I just want to give a brief clinical update of the cases we have thus far for the day. So we have 90 cases, as Minister would have said, positive so far. 84 of those cases are still in hospital. There's one person in Scarborough on a ventilator at present. There are 9 persons in the Cora Hospital. All of them are stable and well. There are 74 persons presently in Couva, 2 in ICU. 1 is actually on a ventilator. There are 15 persons in the high dependency unit, all stable. The remainder of the patients, which are 57 persons, all ambulatory, all stable, and potentially, actually, I would have spoken to the CEO early this morning to put arrangements in place to possibly decant cases over the next couple of days to other locations, including Cora, so that we have the persons that are asymptomatic, very low risk, coming out of the hospital and awaiting their negative test so that they can be discharged home. So that will be happening in the next few days. For now, I just want to say thank you and back over to Minister Cox.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Parasram. Let's hear from the Attorney General, the Honorable Faris Al-Rawi, who will brief us on the government's plan to release certain categories of prisoners and reduce the prison population in its fight against COVID-19.
Good morning, Ministers, and good morning to Trinidad and Tobago. The Honorable Prime Minister initiated a discussion concerning the management of people in areas of concentration. Around the world, many countries have had a similar conversation, specifically as it relates to our prisons. As at today's date, there are 3,959 prisoners in our respective institutions. There are several prisons, as you know, across Trinidad and Tobago, and we have the Immigration Detention Center as well. In looking at that particular management, that issue, the government has come up with a concept paper, having had a look at the many jurisdictions around us, from the CARICOM regions, St. Lucia, a couple other examples, Jamaica, etc., where the discussion is alive, and also around the world in Europe and the Middle East and Asia Pacific regions as well. What we have proposed is a very careful formula to manage those persons who fit certain conditions for release out of prison. In the prison structure, you are in incarceration, you are in a prison in 2 manners. On the first hand, you can be there by way of what is known as remand. That is, you are put into custody, you are put into prison, awaiting a trial. If you are in remand, you may be there with or without the right to bail. For example, persons who are convicted, who are on charges of murder, will not have that as a bailable offense. Persons who are on remand and who have the right to access bail, many of them are in the situation where they have been granted bail but cannot access the bail. In other words, they can't produce the security to allow for them to come out of prison. That's on the remand side. You may also be in prison in conviction state. That is where a court has passed a sentence and sent you to jail for the carrying out of your time in prison. The Bail Act, the Constitution, and also the prison structures allow us to have a better look at this situation in a very careful way. And I want to just be very mindful to use that word, careful way. The entity that has the discretion with respect to passing a sentence or with respect to giving bail is solely the courts of Trinidad and Tobago. That right is a judicial function, and only the courts manage the granting of bail and upon conditions. The entity or personality that has the ability to manage whether your sentence will be reduced or not also, very importantly, is in the office of the President of Trinidad and Tobago. The President has that power under Section 87 of the Constitution to commute, to grant pardons, to give conditional releases in a number of circumstances. Applications can be made to the President under the Constitution. In the prison structure, I want to remind that prisoners actually serve an 8-month year. They don't actually serve a full year. So a year in prison in calculation time is done by way of reference to 8 months, and you can have a remission in the system of counting months or years in the prison, which allow you to have an earliest possible date of release. In this structure of the President, that is the constitutional power, the courts, that is the power of a court to consider granting bail in circumstances, firstly, where they are on remand and bail can be granted to anybody who is not yet convicted, or if you have been convicted, if you are on appeal, the Court of Appeal, the High Court, they have the ability to consider bail being granted even if you have been convicted. And then the prison structure, in these three arrangements, the government has, from a policy point of view, commenced a discussion with the Chief Justice and the general elements of the judiciary, the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Prisons Service, the Commissioner of Police, insofar as the Trinidad and Tobago Police have records and manage offences, and also very importantly with the new body that we have birthed under the Legal Aid Authority, that is the Public Defenders Division. Many people are not aware, because of the COVID situation, that we in fact already launched and have up a Public Defenders Division, which allows people who don't have attorneys at law to have competent representation by the state if they are without an attorney to represent them. The discussion amongst those people have been managed by way, firstly, of the policy paper, secondly, by way of a proposed action to be brought by the Attorney General in the name of the Attorney General, very similar to what we did in managing the release of persons for the marijuana offences back in December 2019. In the proposal at present, we're looking at the Attorney General bringing an action to the court where the defendants, and I use that term carefully, in the court will include the Registrar of the Court, the Commissioner of Prisons, the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Commissioner of Police, so that all of the records concerning certain inmates can be brought forward to the court. At the court, therefore, we will have the ability to have a judge assigned to consider bail for people who are not yet convicted. We can have all of the records before the court, and therefore we can consider persons who meet certain criteria having a better managed form of access to bail. For people who are convicted, if there is an appeal that is current before the Court of Appeal, or at the High Court, for instance, if you were in the position of a magistrate having convicted you, the Bail Act allows for the grant of bail in circumstances where you have been sentenced and there is an appeal. And then thirdly, with respect to persons who have been convicted and are serving sentences, there is still the option, if material is available, to approach the President via the Constitution, via the Mercy Committee, and then to seek managing their sentences in a different way. I'm sure you're all very interested in what the numbers look like and what the criteria for this exercise will include. I can tell you that at the remand end, we have looked at non-violent offences, referred to as minor offences particularly, and the number that we've come up with so far from a cross-reference from the prisons data and the court is approximately 149 people. On the convicted side, persons serving sentences right now, we have approximately 239 people. When we look at this arrangement, and I'm sure you're quite interested as to what minor means, we have people who are serving sentences for matters including failure to pay maintenance, traffic offences, obscene language, resisting arrest, a number of matters that really ought to be considered as minor offences. We also have the remnants of people on marijuana charges where the amounts were above the dangerous drugs limit of 60 grams, 30 grams when we were looking at that. On the convicted side, we have a similar position where categories of offences such as those that I've just described are also there in conviction. Quite remarkably, the data from the prisons demonstrates that we have people in prison for 3 months, 6 months again, with sentences certainly all under 12 months for minor offences. The government's proposal in looking at the management of 3,959 prisoners is to effectively take a very careful approach, starting in the courts of Trinidad and Tobago, where all of the data is brought to the court environment, the relevant voices are heard, Commissioner of Police, Director of Public Prosecutions, the Public Defenders Division, the prisons, and the Registrar of the Court, because the Registrar of the Court has all of the files which will have the particulars. That way, the judge would have before the court the material to consider. Is there a victim impact to be considered, etc.? This is a very careful judicial exercise, certainly not a government exercise. That will be applied across the two categories, as we shall be advised. Firstly, those persons who are not yet sentenced, not convicted, they are on remand. And secondly, in respect of persons who may have been convicted, who are either on appeal or who have the right of access of a pardon. In this total construct, I can inform that Mr. Fayed Hussein, Senior Counsel, a well-reputed constitutional attorney, leads a team on behalf of the Attorney General, and we certainly have the experience of approaching the court in this type of structure where we took a very novel approach in the dangerous drugs for the marijuana releases. You'll recall in December of this year, where we went to the court and brought forward all of the persons who were in prison and who met the criteria. We roughly sorted out approximately 516 people that fit that criteria. So we've had an experience that tells us that we can manage this process in a very careful way. I would just like to end by saying that this is not a knee-jerk reaction. It is certainly not a position which is inconsistent with the government's argument on bail. I want to remind, because I've paid attention to some of the commentary coming from the opposition in particular, we are still very firm that the very serious offences, and especially possession of firearms, possession of automatic weapons, possession of weapons of war, we consider, as we have passed in the Senate and we're still in the House, we consider that those matters for the grant of bail ought to be very seriously circumscribed. And we have proposed in a very novel piece of law that we reverse the burden and that those people approach the court to show why they should be granted bail. In other words, then, we put a very high hurdle to the judicial exercise. This is definitely in keeping with the government's exercise already carried out. Firstly, where we did maximum sentence indication. Secondly, where we encouraged an exercise in the prisons to locate people who had passed the maximum sentence that they could possibly get if they were convicted. Thirdly, it is consistent with our approach that we took for the decriminalization of marijuana. Fourthly, this position is meant to zero in on minor offenses for situations in particular where people have already been granted bail and they cannot access the bail. The data shows us that we have people who can't raise $10,000 in security, can't raise $5,000 in security, where a court has already put that security limit, but people are still in remand incarceration and cannot get out. In other words, then, a court has already considered that it is appropriate for these people to be out on bail. I think that that gives a general orientation. I'm sure that there will be many questions, and perhaps I can clarify at question time. Minister Cox.
Thank you very much, Honorable Attorney General. At this time, I would like to, members of the media, we have expanded the pool of reporters to give as much of your colleagues an opportunity to pose questions to us. But that means in our limited time, we will have to give each media house a chance to get at least one question in. Let's keep this in mind as we begin taking your questions. The floor is now open. Remember to identify yourself and the media house you represent before posing your question. I recognize Akash Samaru.
Hi, good morning, ministers. Good morning, Dr. Parasram.
Morning.
Permit me just a couple of questions. My first question is about the data Dr. Parasram showed us. Will that information be made available to the public? If so, how can we access it? If not, well, why not?
Dr. Parasram?
Hi, good morning. So basically, I think we just made the data available to the public, and it will be shared. It can be shared to the media houses. I don't think that is an issue with our primary contact map. So that will be shared. Can you repeat your second question, please, Akash?
Right, no, the second question I'm going to, so that will be shared with us, so we will be able to access that information,
Sure.
Dr. Parasram.
Yeah.
Okay, how soon could that happen?
Well, I think we can share that right away, maybe after the
Right
conference.
away? All right, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Right, my second question, technology aside, I want to ask about the fifth person who succumbed to COVID-19. And again, our condolences to the family. I know you're very strict on patient confidentiality, but can you tell me at which facility this person died?
Well, again, and you said it, I mean, patient confidentiality is utmost with us. Especially when we're dealing with deaths, we have to be very careful about what information we release in the public domain. And I wouldn't really want to go into that level of detail for any particular patient at this point.
Okay, thank you. I'll recognize Stephen Cummings, 98.1.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
Stephen?
Yes. Just a question for Dr. Parasram. Dr. Parasram, you talked about a hidden contact, and this poses some measure of concern. I want you, if you can, to develop a little further on that. It is that, we're talking about, is it that we're talking about some projected hidden statistics that have also been factored into the overall Trinidad and COVID-19 cases? And my second question is that where are we at present in Trinidad and Tobago? Are we still at community, or should I start with local spread or community spread?
So in terms of the concept of hidden contact, so what I described before is that a person has symptoms of COVID-19, later on tests positive, moves about in a large grouping. For instance, they go to the supermarket, the example I used before, I'll use it again. So goes to the supermarket, has coughing and sneezing, uses a trolley. The person that comes in thereafter doesn't know the first individual at all, would use the same trolley that we would have used, of course not sanitize your hands, picked up droplets from that fomite, and now proceeded to actually get infected. So the second person would be a hidden contact. There's little or no way from an epidemiological perspective to actually track that person. They would not have been a known contact to the first one, and therefore when we do our tracing after the fact, we would see primary contacts, secondary contacts, tertiary contacts. Those are people that are known historically to the first individual. It is those are hidden contacts, and in any epidemic it can happen. What gives us great concern, and why we have been saying, and I have been saying, that we need to behave as if everyone around us is infected, is that we have to take the preventative measures so that we stop the flow and the progression from a known contact to a hidden contact. So if we use the barriers as we have suggested, washing your hands often, using your sterilizers, making sure you're coughing into the crook of your sleeve, wearing a mask when you're ill. And if you see in this particular instance, if somebody would have, first of all, if you're ill, you're not supposed to be going to a mass gathering. You're not supposed to be going to a supermarket, a pharmacy, a bank, anywhere of those places. You send someone that is well, if that is possible. If you are to venture out, you wear a mask at all times, making sure. So that's how we minimize the hidden contacts. And that's why we are saying, and we have gone into this phase of stay at home to be safe. And we have restricted movements to essential services because we don't know where the hidden contacts are. No country in the world can track their hidden contacts. And that's why we are taking such stringent public health measures to ensure that all the hidden contacts are minimized, and therefore the primary, secondary, and tertiary contacts that we know of, we are tracking them through the GIS technology and through other means so we can actually minimize the spread of the disease based on clusters and based on contacts that we know. All the other measures we are taking are to provide safety for the rest of the population and to decrease the amount of hidden contacts we have. And that's why I say behave as if everyone around you is a potential carrier of COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Parasram. There's
a second part to the question, if I may.
There's a second part? Okay.
So there's a distinction between local and community. So local is the proper epidemiological term. We use community spread loosely to mean a wider level of spread. So there can be a local case, meaning that we are not able to trace that contact to someone that has traveled recently, someone who has been exposed to someone that has traveled, a suspected case as deemed by a healthcare professional, a confirmed case. So if you can't link it to any of those epidemiologically, we have to assume that is a local case. Community is used interchangeably with local from time to time, but community basically gives the impression there's a large number of local cases occurring in any one area or locality. So that's basically the difference between the two.
Thank you. Rishad Khan, Guardian.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I just have two quick questions that I want to ask. So I'll put them to you one time because I know you want to be concise. So the first question is, what is our protocol when it comes to posthumous testing for the virus? For instance, if there's someone in a hospital who may be elderly and they pass away from a respiratory ailment, do we do posthumous testing for COVID-19? And what's the protocol associated with that? And two, really quickly, CARPA yesterday indicated that there was a worldwide shortage of the reagent, right? So I want to know, how is this going to affect us in getting our labs up and running to test for COVID-19?
Okay, so if I were to take the first question, generally speaking, the guideline for the deceased person is that from the pathologist, autopsies are not generally recommended and are not, in terms of Trinidad's policy, we are not going to do autopsies for persons that have died, even if they are suspected of COVID. The testing posthumously becomes difficult and we are exposing potential persons. So if we have clinical indications that the signs and symptoms were there, we will treat it as if it is COVID related on suspicion rather than trying to confirm. Trying to confirm puts the healthcare worker as well as other persons at risk unnecessarily. So there may not be any testing done beyond the point of death. We would have had samples that were taken prior that we used, as well as the clinical symptoms from the patients that we will use to say whether we think it's highly suspect or not. In terms of the testing that CARPA would have spoke to, Trinidad and Tobago, separate and apart from CARPA, is actually liaising with a number of international agencies, including PAHO, to ensure that we get testing. And as we said yesterday, we're trying to build capacity in Trinidad and Tobago, aside from CARPA, so that we can deal with the shortages that they spoke of.
Let me just come in here to deal with the issue of CARPA and testing. CARPA, as you know, conducted a virtual press conference yesterday. And unfortunately, Dr. Lisa Indar's words may have been innocently misinterpreted. I got a video clip of Dr. Lisa Indar when she spoke about testing. There are in any process, you're going to have three levels of stock. Feedstock that you use on a daily basis, stock coming in, and in the middle, in between that, you have something called buffer stock. Dr. Lisa Indar was quite clear when she said that CARPA has 3 weeks of buffer stock. That was interpreted to mean 3 weeks of stock. CARPA has feedstock used on a daily basis that they feed into the system to do testing. They have stock coming in from Costa Rica, which Dr. Lisa Indar said yesterday. But in between those two layers, in the middle of the sandwich, you have buffer stock, which is stock to take you through an emergency in case your initial feedstock runs out or in case your stock from Costa Rica comes in late. So I just want to clarify, because I think her words may have been innocently misinterpreted, when she said there were 3 weeks of buffer stock. that does not mean 3 weeks of stock. That is cushion stock. Okay? So right now, they are expecting stocks from Costa Rica, but as we have been saying all along, international supply chains have been interrupted, and the only way to manage scarce resources, whether it's PPE or reagents or anything else, is for everyone to stay home. That is the only way now we will flatten the curve. So I just want to clarify CARFA's position yesterday. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Prasram, are you through?
Yes?
Okay. I'd like to call on Nika Pasanlal, Loop TT.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Nika Pasanal here from Loop. Mr. Al-Rawi, this one is for you. I'm trying to get a better understanding of this, the legal process behind getting these possible releases. First of all, how much time, would it take for this process to be completed? And would there be any monitoring done after the fact? Like post-COVID, what happens?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, which is a very good one to clarify. We, all things being equal, are potentially going to approach the court today. When we get to the court today, we're going to have the opportunity to bring all of the parties before the court. In a situation where you're dealing with persons who are convicted or persons who are on remand, there's another side to the equation, and that's the crime itself or the alleged crime. Where does the victim stand? What's the victim's point of view, etc. For that reason, we must hear from the Commissioner of Police, we must hear from the DPP, so the prosecution's point of view, the police's point of view against the individual's position has to be balanced. Otherwise, you would not be able to catch the opportunity to understand a victim's point of view, because there may be a victim impact statement, for example. With that said, we have already pulled the data from the respective sources because we went to work very quickly and have prearranged a lot of the information. If we get into court today or tomorrow, then we expect an immediate return of the cases that are before us, those that appear to be mild or innocent in terms of severity. Let me be careful about that. Not significant cases, no crimes of passion, no crimes of violence, no firearm matters, etc. Those matters are certainly not in the initial consideration of criterion. What we're looking at as well is, very importantly, if you're convicted, you have a sentence, you don't have an appeal in gear, the only entity, the only person with power would be the office of the president. That goes through in the Constitution. The Mercy Committee. The Mercy Committee is comprised of several personalities. The Director of Public Prosecutions, the Minister of National Security, the Attorney General, and other members of society appointed by Her Excellency the President to advise on the exercise of the power of pardon. That is a process which has to happen. What we envisage is that the matters that are before the court can easily be referred to the Mercy Committee, and that the Mercy Committee can go to work on considering the individual matters with expedition. This is a sort of a roundabout answer in effect, because it ultimately depends upon the immediacy of the information that comes in and the judicial care that must be exercised. When a judge decides to vary a condition of bail or to consider somebody who's been sentenced and who's on appeal, the balancing of rights is essential in this position, because we have to look at the societal impact as a whole. So to answer it quickly, we intend to get into court with immediacy. We intend to put all of the data alongside, hear the respective points of view. Fortunately, the court is in full virtual operation. Fortunately, we have already installed video conferencing facilities at the prisons, and we're expanding that as we speak. Fortunately, last night, the Chief Justice settled practice directions to have electronic filing of documents without payment and facility, so we can receive things coming in electronically. We don't even need to attend at the court to file our documents. And very importantly, the Minister of National Security has been hard at work for quite some time on bringing to life the electronic monitoring situation. I can tell you we have an electronic monitoring unit. There are approximately 250 devices That structure for launch was something that we had been working on for quite some time. There are a few things that need to be sorted out into that. So that's a back end available potentially for the monitoring situation. It was something that we were tying into our domestic violence situation, where we have people with correspondent bracelets. For example, a protection order is granted and somebody has to stay away. The other person would have a corresponding device, a proximity alert, to let them know when these things happen. That one is in the background being worked out now in active discussions with the Minister of National Security. So you'll hear a little bit more about that in the days to come.
Thank you very much. I would now like to call on Olive Gonzalez, Newsday.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning, Olive.
Olive Gonzalez from Newsday. I have a question for the CMO. I would like to know, has any of the 4,000 kits donated by China been used? And are they in good working order, since other countries such as Spain and Italy reported that these Chinese kits were faulty?
Right, so the 4,000 kits have been received. We are using them as a Trinidad cohort of kits that CAFA is actually using for us. So they are being used. And to make the distinction in terms of the faulty kits again, we are using PCR kits, which is not a rapid kit. The faulty kits that have come out and have been circulating in the media are rapid test kits. This is a polymerase chain reaction kit that we have in our stock at Trinidad Public Health Lab, which CAFA is using on our behalf.
Thank you very much. Anna Ramdas, Trinidad Express. Is Anna on? Okay, okay, Anna, are you hearing us?
Hi, yes, hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Anna.
A question to the AG. Well, I have questions for the AG and for the health minister, so I'm just going to ask them quickly. For the AG, how many persons from the IDC are to be released? And in the breakdown of the figures, how many men and how many women will be released? And for Minister Dial Singh, is the health system under stress? And can you give a figure as to how many doctors and nurses are deployed at Quora and Cuba? And is there a projection model as to how many cases and deaths we anticipate?
So in answer to you, good morning again, Anna, and thank you for the question. We have in our prison population, as I said a little bit earlier, 3,959 people in jail. Of that, 3,829 are men and 130 are women. In that number of 3,959, we also have people that will not be in the bracket of accessing bail under any circumstances, and that is obviously for the charge of murder. The number of people on charge for murder are 1,115. That is 1,115 of the near 4,000. In our prisons, we have 10 prisons. We have 2 child rehabilitation centers for male and for female. And we also have the detention center. The detention center is a different dynamic. That is run by the Chief of Immigration, Ministry of National Security, Minister of National Security. So the exercise of that discretion can be handled outside of court processes for some of those matters. Usually you're at detention center for breach of immigration laws or immigration regulations. That pool is being managed slightly differently, and we're attempting to get that information outside of this process because there is a separate discretion that can be managed there.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. I'll try to answer your question about modeling. I just want to quote from a report from the Imperial College COVID-19 response team. I'll just quote a paragraph to tell you the basis on which we model. This is Imperial College speaking. We estimate that in the absence of interventions, COVID-19 would result in 7 billion infections and 40 million deaths globally this year. Mitigation strategies focus on shielding the elderly and slowing but not interrupting transmission would reduce this burden by half, saving 20 million lives. But we predict that even in this scenario, health systems in all countries will be quickly overwhelmed. That's what I spoke to earlier. The Trinidad and Tobago context. We have 90 cases. The 49 cases that came in from one source, the cruise ship, in statistical terms, and I am not advising myself here, I ran these figures by statisticians and an actuary. So this is the statisticians and the actuaries' interpretation of data. You take out the 49 because that is what is called an outlier, and you focus on the 41. So we have 41 cases that have developed since our first case on March the 11th. The actuaries and the statisticians have told me that that is statistically insignificant and insufficient to make projections. The countries around the world that are doing their doubling rate always do their analysis based on their first 100 cases. And that is what we have been advised to do by the actuaries and the statisticians. So we have 41 cases. That gives us our first data set. We can only start to make projections which can stand some scrutiny based on the advice of the statisticians and the actuaries when we reach our first 100 cases. So we have to get our next 59 cases to add to the 41. However, in planning for COVID, especially for the severe cases that will affect the elderly, and this is where we are concerned about, and this is where I will give you some statistics now on ventilator capacity. The public health system has about 160 to 170 ventilators across the system. But we are not using all that for COVID because our hospital system continues to operate. In Couva, we have 12 ventilators. As I said earlier at earlier press conferences, we got in 15, another 10, taking that up to 37. I also gave instructions that work at AREMA should be reprogrammed, and I'm happy to report that as of Tuesday, another 15 ventilators have come on stream at Couva, which gives us a capacity of 52 to deal solely with COVID. Based on the international data, using millions of cases or hundreds of thousands of cases around the world, we know that we are following so far international patterns, which speak to you need to have 5% ventilator capacity based on your total case burden. 52 ventilators at this current time, and we are getting in more, will give us the ability to deal with a case burden of 1,040 positive cases. 1,040 positive cases, 5% of that is 52 ventilators. Currently, we have 90 cases. So we are in I keep saying, whilst we are in a good position, if as a society we don't conduct ourselves properly over the next couple of weeks, couple of days, our best laid plans could amount to naught. And that's why I'm advising the public, let us not test the system too much. The system took a big stress test when we had those 68 persons from the cruise, and 40 in one fell swoop were tested positive. That was a big hump that we got over. The system was tested, it was trained, and it stood up to that test, it stood up to that strain. But I fear that if we continue to test it like health systems all around the world, we don't want it to break. That is why in my initial address this morning, I said, how we behave this week, how we behave from today, will determine how scarce resources are used. So, to encapsulate, I have been advised by the statisticians and the actuaries that 41 positive cases taken out the 49 from the cruise ship is statistically insignificant at this point in time to make projections. They are waiting for our first 100 cases, barring the 49, to start to make projections, and that's what international protocols tell us. That is when you could start to talk about Dublin rates and so on. So, Anna, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that comprehensive answer. Priya Bihari, ACP News.
Hi, good morning. I have some questions for the Attorney General.
You will. How many questions do you have, Priya? In the interest of time, 2. Yes, we'll take 2. Okay, give us the 2 one time.
Thank you. AG, an attorney called me and he asked that he has some clients who have to report to a police station every day. Do they still go to report one? And in this system you have that is going to take place that will help in terms of reducing the population in the prisons. For those of us who have covered the courts, anytime an accused person appears and there has to be some tracing done, more times than none, I mean, in most occasions, the police never have the information there, and it always causes some sort of delay. Are you going to ensure that this process is something that is going to be smoothly done? And because it seems to me that when you have so many cases that would come before the courts to get this process done, it appears to be a recipe for disaster.
Sure. Thank you for the questions, which certainly are very valid questions. Obviously, I advise the state and not any individual client. But if you have a requirement to report to the police, obviously you must report to the police. Conditionalities have to be met. So that is a clear situation that we cannot treat with that. The second thing that you've asked is with respect to tracing and the ease of accessing bail. It's for this reason that we propose to have all of the parties before the court. So in the contemplated action, it'll be the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago bringing an action where the defendants are not adversarial defendants, but are defendants in the court. Those defendants will be and include Commissioner of Prisons, the Commissioner of Police, the Registrar of the Supreme Court, the public defender is going to be assisting, but albeit not as a party, and the Director of Public Prosecutions will be there as well. In that scenario, therefore, tracing, which is an exercise for the police, can be managed directly before the court because they are the ones that have the access to prior convictions, to whether there are charges, etc. And equally, so too does the Registrar of the Supreme Court have access to that. So this is a mechanism that we propose be put into place. Again, we as the government are not entering into the judicial sphere. The matter of the exercise of bail and condition and the privileges around it, that is a matter for a court and strictly a court. What we're doing is we're enabling the environment to try and get this solution because we're looking at numbers and risk factor. If there is an epidemic outbreak in any one of the concentrated areas of Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly a prison is one of them, even though we've spread the load across positions. You heard the Commissioner of Prisons yesterday very commendably speak to the holding position at the Eastern Regional Prison, where we take prisoners in, we manage them, and effectively only introduce healthy patients into the position. All of that is part of the management of this COVID issue. There are some further amendments that we're looking at to the law. As a cabinet, we're discussing certain next step provisions. The Office of the Attorney General has been literally at full functionality in making sure that we perform all of the functions for government, all of the borrowings, all of the lendings, all of the laws that have to be written, all of the regulations. It's a continuous day and night exercise to make sure we get this right. As the Minister of Health has repeatedly said, and as has the Prime Minister, it's a very fluid situation which requires us to have multiple options available at any point in time.
Thank you very much. I would now like to call on TTT, Crystal Wilson.
Two quick questions. Of the people who will qualify for possible release, are they going to be medically screened for other highly contagious viruses and diseases before release? My other question, based on the response of the public, social media and otherwise, not everyone appears to be as forgiving or understanding regarding government's position to release these certain members of the prison population. Any response to those members of the public to alleviate their concerns?
Very good question. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some clarity. So yes, obviously, anybody that is going to come out of the prison's environment is going to be the subject of medical protocols, as the chief medical officer will advise. Secondly, the very important question of ensuring that at-risk prisoners don't come into the system, and the rights of victims in this scenario. It's for that very reason I want to emphasize that the persons before the court will include the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Commissioner of Police. It is in that regard that we get the prosecution's point of view. The victim's point of view is translated in that position. Very often we have victim impact statements. We know what the risk is. But let me explain it this way. The category of cases that we're looking at are failure to pay maintenance, traffic offenses, obscene language, resisting arrest, possession of marijuana above 30 grams, above 60 grams, possession of a smoking device for marijuana. There's one person inside of there for cultivation of marijuana. We're looking at motor vehicle and road traffic offenses, not the serious kinds. So we're not looking at blood crimes at all. We're not looking at any aggravated position at all. We're looking at the very low risk criterion, and the very important safeguard in this is that the court will hear from all aspects of the crime, the alleged crime or the convicted crime. In particular, the victim's voice must be heard and factored by a court. This is not going to be an easy exercise. It is a carefully balanced perspective. In the vast majority of cases that we're talking about, it's where people have already been granted bail. A court considered the grant of bail, but people are languishing in there because they're just too poor to access bail. They can't raise the $5,000 to access bail. Instead, the state is keeping them in the prison at great cost to the taxpayers with certain risks in the COVID environment. It's largely that category of person that we're looking at. Very low risk, already granted bail, just too poor to manage the bail.
Thank you very much, Attorney General. I now recognize Urvashi Tawari, TV6.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning to the ministers.
Good morning.
I'd like to talk a little bit about, Urvashi from TV6. I'd like to talk a little bit about the death rate. Granted, I heard and understood everything Minister Diyal Singh just said. He broke up the statistics. If we look at 5 persons out of 90 dying, we're talking about a 5% death rate. If we compare that to the global rate, it's considerably higher. Could it be that we have a high diabetic, hypertensive, high-risk population in TNT? Or could it be because, on the other hand, that the pool or scope of testing wasn't wide enough to pick up even those, a greater number of positives? That is, the denominator was, in fact, too small. And in that same vein, if the CMO could tell us how many of the cruise ship passengers would have passed away, so we could break up the statistics even further, and as well as, are we part of the solidarity trials, and is there consideration for us to join?
Okay, so Rashi, thank you very much for that question. You would recall that I started off my answer to Anna saying that our case burden, as defined by the actuaries and the statisticians, are too small to make inferences from. We must remember that. It's only 90 positive cases. So 5 out of 90, yes, sounds high. The global death rate varies from as much as 10% to as little as 0.5%. But that is when you consider a statistically large number of cases. it is worth repeating that in Trinidad and Tobago, when we take off the 49 cases from one source, we have 41 cases. And the statisticians and the actuaries have told us quite clearly that number is statistically insignificant to try to make any inferences. We have to wait, according to them, according to the experts, when we reach our 100th case, taking out the 49. So we're at 41. We have to get another 59 cases before we can say our death rate of 5 is statistically significant. However, what we are following so far is the international norm where the deaths are occurring in the elderly population with pre-existing conditions, and Trinidad and Tobago, unfortunately, as I've been saying since becoming Minister of Health, we have a crisis of diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, cardiovascular disease. So the inference you are drawing may be a correct one. It may be due to the fact that Trinidad and Tobago, we have an inherently unhealthy population due to diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. The Chief Medical Officer can probably answer the other part of the question.
Yes, Dr. Parasram?
Yeah, so just to add to what Minister is saying, our group is very small one, statistically very insignificant. And we have to look at the death rate, as he has said, internationally, where they have thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases, and they have drawn their inferences based on large numbers. The larger the number of cases you have, the more statistically significant the conclusions that we draw from them become. In terms of the study that you alluded to, I have communicated with the University of the West Indies up to a couple of days ago. They are actually bringing the proposal to the Ministry of Health within the next week so that Trinidad can consider, and it has to be considered by the Ethics Committee of the Ministry of Health as well as being considered by PAHO before we can actually take that step into looking at treatments and possible treatment options as outlined in this study.
Thank you very much. Tobago Channel 5. Candice? Candice, we're not hearing you.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, Candice.
Yes, just going back to the discussion about testing and so on. Is there any consideration being given to having a lab set up in Tobago for testing? Because in all of your discussions over the past couple of weeks, there's no mention about testing in Tobago.
Chief Medical Officer?
Yeah, so I have discussed the matter with Dr. Hoyt in Tobago. She's in the process of actually looking to locate a machine at this point in Tobago. If she doesn't have one, we can allocate one for her. But in Trinidad, setting up its own testing capacity beyond CAFA, we are taking into account the use of North Central's facility as well as possibly MRF to service Tobago. But Tobago is also looking at their capacity internally, and we are assisting them in all regards as to setting up a lab if and when they need to.
Okay, thank you. IETV News.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning,
morning.
IETV.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Okay, I have two questions, one for the CMO and one for the AG. First of all, Mr. CMO, to the average citizen who would have seen the map that you just showed us, we would have seen literally a group in central Trinidad. Can you clarify whether those persons came from the cruise or if they were imported cases? Meaning, if they are imported, the chances of possible community spread. And to the AG, in terms of the persons, you said the prisoners who have a chance of being released, do you foresee repeat offenses? And if so, what is the next step in dealing with it? Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the cases that we have been seeing on the map, what we are showing predominantly are of the 90 cases, the majority, if not close to all of them, are imported cases. So in terms of managing those cases, we would have been dealing with their primary contacts, making sure they stay at home during that time, as well as their secondary and tertiary contacts. It does not include the group at Balandra. Clearly on the map, there's a star that indicates all cases from Balandra. So that is demarcated by a star. So you will see the star when you look at the map. So the other cases are all outside of that cohort of persons.
Thank you very much. Yolan Thomas.
She posed a second question.
Oh, there's another question? Go ahead.
The question was with respect to repeat offences, etc. Obviously, the discussion of repeat offenders, or recidivism as they call it in the fancy term, is something that has occupied the attention of courts and sociologists and criminologists for a very long time. The key aspect inside of here is that, of course, it will be monitored. You actually don't know if somebody reoffends until they reoffend. I can tell you that we have drafted a very comprehensive parole bill. It's one of the things that we want to bring to the Parliament with expedition. And that will give us a better chance of tracking offender management, etc. I want to tie that in as well to the electronic monitoring that we have literally on deck for launch. There are 250 devices that we can bring into the system. It took a lot of time to create the geographic information systems and the bodies and structures and rules and regulations to have all of this go to work. It was something that would have rolled its way out, had it not been for COVID, in a matter of weeks, post a few amendments that we potentially need to do. So we're tracking victims, we're tracking offenders, we're tracking reoffending. It'll be an ongoing exercise. Obviously, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and the Trinidad and Tobago Defence Force in all of its divisions have a very heavy blanket of security over this country, and we're all taking guidance from the Chief Medical Officer in this particular dynamic. So first priority is the safety of Trinidad and Tobago from the dangerous infectious disease, which is COVID-19. We're in a global pandemic. We're in very uncharted waters nationally and internationally, and all that we can do is to take the advice of the Chief Medical Officer to make sure that we avoid any expansion. I think the one thing I'd like to say is we don't even want to get into the statistical growth in Trinidad and Tobago. We want to stop the growth. We don't want to get up to the 100 where we're now looking at these things. We have to take the medical advice given to us. It's why we've operated these laws under the Public Health Ordinance, because health has priority in this entire position.
Thank you very much. Yolan Thomas, Caribbean Lifestyle Communication. Is Yolan Thomas there? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of today's virtual media conference. Do remember that the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Communications are your only credible sources of government information on COVID-19. I am Donna Cox, Minister of Communications, and thank you for joining us today as the government continues its efforts to flatten the curve and beat COVID-19. May God bless Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you.
And that was live coverage of the
TAJ 92.3 FM. We sound better.
COVID-19 on TTT, Chalk City, 91.1 FM. Next, 99.1 FM.